Neil Carlson here in Grand Forks at the federal courthouse, where U.S. Attorney Drew Wrigley is talking about charges now filed against Ruben Cruz in the officer-involved shooting in Grafton. Here's all of that news conference.
Prior to the events that we were addressing today in the courthouse here in Grand Forks in federal court, prior to those events, the defendant in this case had been charged with being a drug dealer by federal court in South Dakota. On August 14th, we have alleged in our charging documents, and the grand jury has indicted this defendant on August 14th of dramatically elevating his state of play beyond being an alleged drug dealer. As you'll see in our federal indictment, the grand jury has returned an indictment including overt acts focusing on the attempted murder of a Grafton police officer. Officer Campoverde is not able to be here today, but I spoke with him yesterday, and we're all pleased, obviously, and we're all fortunate that he is surviving his injuries. So today, the grand jury, we've announced the grand jury's indictment of the defendant, Ruben Cruz, with at this point 3 additional federal counts, 2 involving allegations of his work and conspiracy in drug dealing, and the third one of those in using a firearm, both possessing, brandishing, and using that firearm in furtherance of his drug crime. Under federal law, which I should point out, I want to thank our participants here today, and we're all available for your questions. To my immediate right is the state's attorney from Walsh County, North Dakota. She has been up there for quite some number of years. We were just talking about that, going on 20 years as an assistant state's attorney, and now the state's attorney for Walsh County, State's Attorney Kelly Cole. Back in the far right here is the Chief of Police from Grafton, North Dakota. We won't be talking about the facts of that night, but I can share with you that the Chief responded to these events as well. I've been out to the scene of these alleged occurrences last Friday, and I've seen the proximity of the crime scene to the law enforcement center, and it's quite something. Also responding that night was the sheriff from Walsh County. Sheriff Juergens is back here to my left. Chief of Police Dumas, as I said, State's Attorney Cole. I wanted to point out that from the very beginning, the hours after these occurrences, that I was in contact by phone with my state and county law enforcement partners. It's important for people to recognize that we're working hand in glove on these matters. I appreciate very much the state's attorney showing up today. There are obviously state charges that could be brought to bear in this matter as well. We've worked out in the ensuing days what the appropriate sequence would be, federal charging, and then other matters to be addressed up ahead. Federal law enforcement is working hand in glove with Chief Dumas and with Sheriff Juergens, the North Dakota BCI, and others who are working on this, North Dakota Highway Patrol, a host of other agencies that are working, and we appreciate it very much. It's important, I think, that people see that united front. Where appropriate, and I would tell you that we presented this matter to the grand jury because this is one of those cases where appropriate. Federal law provides what I'll call an elevated, forceful, appropriate set of options in response to escalations of and severity of violence. As I said at the beginning of this, the defendant in this case walked into that day as an alleged drug dealer under an indictment out of South Dakota, my federal counterparts down in South Dakota. And at the end of that day, and now as a result of this federal grand jury indictment, he stands as a twice accused federal drug trafficker and conspirator, and elevated his state of play, his level of play, to the attempted murder of a Grand Forks, North Dakota, I'm sorry, a Grafton, North Dakota police officer. You heard, if you were in the hearing, and I know a couple of you were, the potential penalties under federal law. And I point out that those would be in addition to anything that would happen under state law. Just at the foundation point, the allegations of the grand jury today hold, under our federal indictment here, for the drug components of it, mandatory sentences of 10 years. Mandatory sentences of 10 years and up. The alleged violence that the grand jury has said they are alleging accompanied that drug trafficking brings additional minimum of 10 years consecutive. That's before anyone hears the first bit of evidence about Officer Campoverde taking a bullet and the circumstances inside of Grafton, which it was interesting. Chief Dumas told me last Friday when I was in Grafton that it was the first time in Grafton's history that there had been an exchange of gunfire with law enforcement in that community. So before anyone has heard any evidence in addition to that, if and when these allegations become convictions, the defendant is facing in federal court a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years. And we're just talking about the federal indictments here in North Dakota. That says nothing of the indictments in South Dakota. With that, we'll take some questions, unless you have some statements you'd like to make beforehand. Any of you?
I don't have anything to add.
Okay.
Can you talk about whether all the officers involved in the shooting of Mr. Cruz have been cleared of any wrongdoing? And can you talk more specifically about the timeline? There's been some suggestion that once Mr. Cruz was already shot, he was shot again.
Yeah, I don't know where you heard a suggestion like that. And I don't know why you would raise a question of any allegations of wrongdoing. I've heard nothing along those lines, nothing in the facts that I've heard about this case, and I'm not aware of any substantial or credible allegations of wrongdoing by anyone. But they're going through their administrative processes, obviously, federal, state, local law enforcement working together, and those matters will be vetted out up ahead. But I've heard no credible allegations of anything along those lines at all, and there are plenty of witnesses out there.
Is the minimum 10 or 20 years?
Well, because maybe I didn't state it correctly, it's 20 because they have to be stacked. The 924C, the firearms charges, the discharge of a firearm, in this instance, the attempted murder, we allege the attempted murder of Officer Campoverde, that has to be stacked on top of, that is consecutive under federal law to any sentence for the drug trafficking crime or any other allegations or other crimes in this case. So you've got the mandatory minimum of 10 years on the drug case, and then if there's a conviction on the firearms component of it, that'd be 10 years consecutive. So it's a mandatory. You're looking at mandatory sentences if convicted of a minimum of 20 years on just the North Dakota indictments alone, and that's only on the federal side. It says nothing of the federal indictment out of South Dakota. It says nothing of any state charges that might come down the road in North Dakota.
Was bail set today?
No, they waived even a detention discussion today, and they could have had, they're entitled to have that within a number of days. I think the judge said it would have been Monday, and they waived that indefinitely. And so it's undetermined whether they're even going to seek to have him released. I think you've got experienced counsel there. They're aware of the factors that go into a release decision. We'll see, but until further notice, that hearing's not set.
Is it common to serve a search warrant at that, or an arrest warrant at that time of day?
Common? Well, I mean, you talk to any of the men and women in law enforcement, they'll tell you, the time of day, unlike the rest of us, the time of day isn't determinant of their work, right? Their work goes on around the clock. And it's, time of day when there's a federal warrant or there's a state warrant for somebody and law enforcement has a beat on their whereabouts, they do the very best they can to make sure that warrant is executed with safety for everyone involved, for the public, safety for law enforcement, obviously, and safety for the people who they're seeking to bring into custody. The allegations in this case, bear out, and I think I'll leave it to the indictment. I don't want to go in too far into the facts that are being alleged from that night. There are overt acts. That's a public document as of now that we've had this hearing. That's been unsealed and will be available for all of your review.
So can you talk about the timeline at all? What happened and who fired when?
No, we're not going to talk about that right now. But you know, as these court hearings proceed, there's some discussion. But really, the time for all of that becomes if when there's a trial in this matter, and that got scheduled today as well, tentatively scheduled for November 3rd, in front of Judge Welty in federal court. Presumably that would be down in Fargo, and they had some dates also for pretrial motions. It's, you know, more typical, maybe especially in the era of COVID-19, that this would be for a little further on down the road. But the investigation continues as to Mr. Cruz and his associates.
In Grand Forks, I'm Neil Carlson reporting for iNewZ.TV.